The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the Kuwaiti border as American satellites captured images that would change the course of history. It was August 2nd, 1990, and nearly 100,000 Iraqi troops, supported by 700 tanks, were pouring across the frontier in a coordinated blitzkrieg that would conquer an entire nation in less than 12 hours. The world watched in stunned disbelief as Saddam Hussein's forces overran Kuwait City, seizing control of oil fields that represented 10% of global reserves and triggering the largest American military deployment since Vietnam. What began as a brazen invasion would become a defining moment of the post-Cold War era, a massive military operation that would test whether international coalitions could still enforce global order in a world no longer divided between superpowers. The clock was ticking, and the question hanging over Washington, Riyadh, and capitals across the world was simple yet terrifying. Could Saddam be stopped before his tanks rolled into Saudi Arabia and seized control of the oil that powered the global economy? To understand how the world arrived at this precipice, you must first understand the man who brought it there. Saddam Hussein had ruled Iraq with an iron fist since 1979, building a cult of personality around himself, while brutally suppressing any opposition. His regime was characterized by secret police, torture chambers, and a willingness to use chemical weapons against his own Kurdish population in the north. But Saddam also harbored grand ambitions that stretched far beyond Iraq's borders. He saw himself as the rightful leader of the Arab world, a modern Saladin who would unite the region under his banner and challenge Western dominance of the Middle East. His vision of pan-Arab nationalism was fueled by oil revenues, military spending that consumed nearly 40% of Iraq's budget, and a dangerous combination of paranoia and messianic delusion. The seeds of invasion were planted during the brutal 8-year war between Iraq and Iran that had only ended 2 years earlier in 1988. That conflict had cost Iraq nearly 500,000 casualties and left the nation drowning in debt, owing approximately $80 billion to various creditors, including $40 billion to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait alone. The war had been a strategic stalemate, draining Iraq's treasury while failing to achieve Saddamist territorial ambitions in the oil-rich Iranian province of Kush. As the 1980s drew to a close, Iraq found itself in a devastating economic crisis. Oil prices had collapsed to less than $15 per barrel, roughly half of what Iraq needed to balance its budget. Inflation was spiraling out of control, unemployment was rising, and the Iraqi people who had sacrificed so much during the war with Iran were growing restless. Saddam needed a scapegoat, and he found one in Kuwait. He accused his tiny neighbor of stealing Iraqi oil through slanted drilling, a technique where wells drilled near the border allegedly extracted petroleum from Iraqi fields beneath the frontier. Iraq claimed Kuwait had stolen $2.4 billion worth of oil from the Rumaila field that straddled their border. Beyond these accusations, Saddam harbored historical grievances that dated back decades. Iraq had never fully accepted the legitimacy of Kuwait's independence, viewing the emirate as a historical province that had been artificially separated by British colonial authorities in the early 20th century. The current border had been drawn when Britain controlled both territories, and Iraqi nationalists had long claimed that Kuwait was rightfully the 19th province of Iraq. Throughout the spring and summer of 1990, tensions escalated as Saddam's rhetoric became increasingly threatening. He accused Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates of exceeding their OPEC production quotas, deliberately flooding the market with cheap oil to keep prices low at Iraq's expense. Every dollar drop in the price per barrel costs Iraq $1 billion in annual revenue, a catastrophic loss for a nation already teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. At Arab League meetings in May and July, Iraqi representatives demanded that Kuwait forgive Iraq's wartime debts and provide an additional $10 billion in financial aid, arguing that Iraq had served as a bulwark, defending the Arab world from Iranian Islamic fundamentalism. When Kuwait refused these demands, offering only $9 billion in debt relief, rather than complete forgiveness, Saddam interpreted this as an act of economic warfare. The United States intelligence community watched these developments with growing concern, but the signals coming from Washington were tragically mixed. On July 25th, just 8 days before the invasion, American Ambassador April Glaspie met with Saddam Hussein in Baghdad. During this fateful conversation, she told him that the United States had no opinion on Arab conflicts like Iraq's border dispute with Kuwait. This statement, whether intended as diplomatic neutrality or catastrophically misinterpreted by Saddam, may have convinced the Iraqi dictator that America would not interfere with his plans. The State Department was focused on maintaining engagement with Iraq, hoping to moderate Saddam's behavior through diplomacy rather than confrontation. This miscalculation would prove to be one of the most consequential diplomatic failures in modern American history. Saddam finalized his invasion plan with characteristic ruthlessness and strategic calculation. The operation would utilize Iraq's Republican Guard divisions, the elite units that served as the regime's Praetorian force. These weren't the poorly trained conscripts who had died in human wave attacks against Iran. These were well-equipped, relatively professional soldiers with modern Soviet tanks and armor. The plan called for a three-pronged assault that would overwhelm Kuwait's small military in a matter of hours. The Hammurabi Division would strike south toward Kuwait City along the coast. The Medina Division would advance through the center of the country, while the Tawakalna division would sweep in from the west. Supporting these armored spearheads were elements of several regular army divisions, special forces units tasked with seizing key installations, and helicopter assault teams that would capture government buildings in the capital. Kuwait's military never stood a chance. The emirate maintained armed forces of only about 16,000 active personnel, equipped with outdated equipment and unprepared for the scale of the assault that struck them in the early morning darkness. The Kuwaiti Air Force managed to evacuate several aircraft to Saudi Arabia, but most of their combat capability was destroyed on the ground in the first hours of fighting. Kuwaiti ground forces fought bravely in isolated pockets, with some units making desperate stands at police stations and military barracks, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. The Emir of Kuwait, Sheikh Haber Al-Ahmad al-Sabah, escaped to Saudi Arabia just ahead of Iraqi special forces sent to capture him. By mid-afternoon, on August 2nd, Iraqi tanks were rolling through Kuwait city's streets. Iraqi soldiers were looting shops and homes, and Saddam Hussein controlled a conquered nation. The invasion sent shockwaves around the world. In Washington, President George H.W. Bush was spending the summer weekend at Camp David when news of the attack reached him. Bush, a former CIA director and vice president, understood immediately that this was not just a regional border dispute but a direct challenge to the international order that had emerged from World War II. The United Nations Charter explicitly prohibited wars of aggression and the annexation of sovereign nations. If Saddam was allowed to simply swallow Kuwait without consequences, it would establish a dangerous precedent that might encourage other regional powers to pursue territorial expansion through military force. Moreover, the strategic implications were staggering. Iraq now controlled 20% of overseas oil production. If Saddam continued south into Saudi Arabia, he would control nearly half of the world's known petroleum reserves, giving him unprecedented leverage over the global economy. Bush's response was swift and unequivocal. Within hours, he declared that the invasion would not stand and began working the phones to build an international coalition. His first call was to Saudi Arabia's King Fahd, whose kingdom was now directly threatened by Iraqi forces massed along the border just a few hundred miles. From the critical oil infrastructure of the eastern province, King Fahd faced an agonizing decision. Allowing American troops onto sacred Saudi soil would be controversial in the conservative kingdom, potentially inflaming religious extremists who opposed any Western military presence in the land of Islam's holiest sites. But the alternative, facing Saddam's battle-hardened army alone, was even more terrifying. Intelligence reports suggested that Iraqi forces could reach Riyadh within days if Saddam decided to continue his offensive. To convince the Saudis, Bush dispatched Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney to Riyadh on August 6th, the commander of U.S. Central Command, who would lead any American military response. Schwarzkopf brought with him satellite photographs showing Iraqi Republican Guard divisions positioned along the Saudi border in offensive formations. The images were stark and undeniable. Hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles were arrayed not in defensive positions, but in attack configurations. Their gun tubes pointed south, toward the kingdom's oil fields. The presentation lasted several hours, with Schwarzkopf methodically laying out both the threat and the proposed American response. He described how U.S. forces would deploy to defend the kingdom, the timeline for their arrival, and the rules of engagement they would follow. Most crucially, Cheney made a personal promise from President Bush that American forces would leave Saudi Arabia once the crisis was resolved, addressing the king's concerns about a permanent American occupation. King Fahd made his decision that same day. American forces were welcome to deploy to Saudi Arabia under the framework of Operation Desert Shield, a defensive operation designed to protect the kingdom and deter further Iraqi aggression. This decision would prove to be one of the most consequential in modern Middle Eastern history, with ramifications that would echo for decades. Within hours of the Saudi agreement, American military transport aircraft were already in the air, beginning the largest and fastest military deployment in American history since World War II. The challenge facing American military planners was immense and unprecedented. They needed to move hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of armored vehicles, hundreds of aircraft, and millions of tons of equipment and supplies across 8,000 miles of ocean to a desert environment where temperatures regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, while modern by regional standards, was not designed to handle the flood of military personnel and equipment that would soon arrive. Ports would need to be expanded, airfields upgraded, supply depots constructed, and an entire logistics network built from scratch in a matter of weeks. Military strategists called it the tyranny of distance, and it would test American military capability to its absolute limit. The first American units to arrive were elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, paratroopers who flew into Dhahran aboard massive C-141 and C-5 transport aircraft. These soldiers understood they were what military planners grimly called a speed bump. They were lightly armed infantry with anti-tank missiles. And little else. If Iraqi armor had rolled south in those first critical days, These paratroopers would have fought and died to buy time for heavier forces to arrive. The soldiers dug fighting positions in the sand, test-fired their weapons, and waited to see if Iraqi tanks would appear on the horizon. The tension during those first weeks was almost unbearable. Intelligence reports about Iraqi intentions were contradictory and unclear. Some analysts believed Saddam was simply consolidating his gains in Kuwait. Others warned that the buildup on the Saudi border was preparation for a knockout blow that would seize the Saudi oil fields before substantial American forces could deploy. Behind the paratroopers came the real combat power that would make Desert Shield a credible deterrent. The 24th Infantry Division Mechanized began loading its M1 Abrams tanks and M2 Bradley fighting vehicles onto cargo ships at ports along America's east coast. The 1st Cavalry Division prepared for deployment from Fort Hood, Texas. The 1st and 3rd Armored Divisions in Germany received orders to redeploy to the Gulf, a decision that would have been unthinkable during the Cold War when these units were positioned to defend Western Europe from Soviet attack. Fighter squadrons from across the Air Force inventory deployed 2 bases throughout the region, F-15 Eagles and F-16 Fighting Falcons. Established air superiority patrols along the Saudi-Kuwaiti border. A-10 Warthogs, specifically designed for destroying Soviet tanks in European battlefields, would now face Iraqi armor in the desert. Bay-52 bombers flew all the way from Basest in the United States, and Diego Garcia, to demonstrate America's strategic reach. The naval buildup was equally impressive. Aircraft carrier battle groups steamed toward the Persian Gulf and Red Sea. The battleships USS Wisconsin and USS Missouri. World War II veterans that had been recommissioned during the Reagan administration's military buildup prepared their 16-inch guns for potential shore bombardment missions. Nuclear submarines took up positions in the region, ready to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles at targets deep inside Iraq if hostilities commenced. Navy SEALs and Marine reconnaissance units began conducting surveillance operations along Kuwait's coast, gathering intelligence on Iraqi defensive positions and preparing for potential amphibious operations. As American forces flowed into theater, President Bush worked tirelessly to build the international coalition that would give Operation Desert Shield both military strength and political legitimacy. This was the new world order that Bush envisioned. One where the United Nations could actually function as its founders had intended, with global powers working together to confront aggression rather than being paralyzed by Cold War rivalries. The collapse of the Soviet Union's power meant that for the first time in decades, the UN Security Council could act decisively. On August 6th, the Security Council passed Resolution 661, imposing comprehensive economic sanctions on Iraq. Resolution 665 followed on August 25th, authorizing a naval blockade to enforce the sanctions. The coalition that assembled was remarkably diverse, reflecting both the breadth of international opposition to Saddam's aggression and the diplomatic skill of the Bush administration. Britain's Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was an early and forceful supporter, dispatching British armored units and Royal Air Force squadrons to the Gulf. France contributed the 6th Light Armored Division and Jaguar Field. Egypt's President Hosni Mubarak sent 2 armored divisions, providing crucial Arab participation that would help deflect accusations that this was simply a Western crusade against an Arab nation. Syria, despite its long-standing rivalry with the United States and support for international terrorism, contributed troops to the coalition, demonstrating the breadth of Arab opposition to Saddam's actions. Saudi Arabia itself committed forces, as did Kuwait's. Smaller contingents came from nations ranging from Morocco to Bangladesh, from Italy to Australia. The Soviet Union's position was particularly significant. Just a few years earlier, Iraq had been a major Soviet client state, armed with Soviet weapons and advised by Soviet military specialists. But the USSR under Mikhail Gorbachev was in its final death throes, desperately seeking Western economic assistance and unwilling to antagonize the United States over Iraq. Soviet diplomats worked alongside American counterparts at the United Nations rather than obstructing them with veto. This cooperation was historic, a tangible sign that the Cold War had truly ended and that international relations were entering uncharted territory. While diplomats negotiated and generals planned, ordinary soldiers adjusted to life in the Saudi desert. The conditions were brutal and disorienting for Americans accustomed to temperate climates. Temperatures soared well above 100 degrees during the day, then plummeted at night. Sand infiltrated everything: weapons, food, communications equipment, vehicles. Soldiers learned to tape over every opening in their gear, to clean their rifles multiple times daily, to drink water constantly, to avoid dehydration. The landscape was alien and featureless, an endless expanse of tan sand and rock with few landmarks. Getting lost during training exercises was common and potentially fatal. The cultural adjustment was equally challenging. Saudi Arabia's strict Islamic practices meant no alcohol, no interaction with local women, no religious services for non-Muslims conducted openly. Female American soldiers, who made up a small but significant portion of the deployed force, had to navigate these restrictions while maintaining their military duties. There were tensions and misunderstandings, but both American forces and their Saudi hosts generally worked to accommodate each other's sensitivities. The Saudis constructed massive base camps in the desert, providing air-conditioned tents, mess facilities, and recreational areas for coalition forces. Americans reciprocated by respecting local customs and working to minimize their cultural footprint. Training intensified as more units arrived. Tank battalions conducted live-fire exercises in the desert, learning to navigate by terrain features in an environment utterly unlike the German forests or American prairies, where they had trained previously. Infantry units practiced fighting in chemical protective gear, preparing for the possibility that Saddam might use the same nerve agents he had deployed against Iran and Iraqi Kurds. The Iraqi chemical weapons arsenal was estimated to include thousands of tons of mustard gas, sarin, and taban. American soldiers received injections of pyridostigmine bromide, a drug intended to protect against nerve agents, and carried atropine auto-injectors that could counteract chemical exposure if administered quickly enough. The psychological weight of this threat was enormous. Chemical weapons are indiscriminate and terrifying, causing agonizing deaths through suffocation or neurological collapse. Back in the United States, the deployment stirred intense debate about whether military action was the appropriate response to Iraq's aggression. Many Americans, particularly those who had lived through Vietnam, were deeply skeptical about another major military intervention in a distant region with unclear objectives. Protesters gathered outside military bases and congressional offices, arguing that sanctions should be given more time to work. That war would cost thousands of American lives, that the conflict was really about oil rather than principle. The counter-argument advanced by the Bush administration and its supporters held that some actions were so egregious, they demanded a forceful response, that Saddam was a brutal dictator who would only understand strength, that allowing aggression to succeed would invite further chaos around the world. Congress became the arena for this debate. The Constitution grants Congress alone the power to declare war. But presidents since Korea had deployed American forces into combat under their authority as commander-in-chief without formal declarations. Bush wanted congressional authorization for any offensive action against Iraq, but was prepared to act without it if necessary. Democrats controlled both houses of Congress, and many were deeply reluctant to authorize war. Hearings stretched through the fall of 1990, with military commanders, diplomats, academics, and former government officials testifying about the wisdom of confronting Iraq militarily versus relying on sanctions and containment. As autumn turned to winter, the military buildup continued relentlessly. The force that had begun as a defensive shield was quietly transforming into an offensive sword capable of liberating Kuwait by force, if necessary. Heavy armored divisions positioned themselves in assembly areas south of the Kuwaiti border. Artillery battalions registered their guns on potential targets. Special operations forces infiltrated across the border on reconnaissance missions, mapping Iraqi defenses and identifying key installations for attack. The 101st Airborne Division conducted air assault training, practicing the helicopter operations that would carry them deep into Iraq when hostilities began. Marine units rehearsed amphibious operations, preparing for potential landings along Kuwait's coast that would force Iraq to defend multiple fronts simultaneously. General Schwarzkopf and his staff developed the operational plan that would guide coalition forces if war came. The plan was audacious and complex, reflecting lessons learned from decades of American military experience. Rather than a straightforward frontal assault into heavily defended Kuwaiti positions, Schwarzkopf envisioned a massive deception operation that would convince Saddam the main attack was coming from the south. Well, American and coalition armor actually swung far to the west in a wide enveloping maneuver. This left hook would cut Iraqi supply lines, isolate Iraqi forces in Kuwait, and position coalition armor to destroy Iraq. Republican Guard divisions in open desert warfare where American technological advantages would be decisive. The plan required moving hundreds of thousands of troops and thousands of vehicles hundreds of miles west without Iraqi intelligence detecting the movement. It was a logistical nightmare that would have been impossible without the months of preparation that Desert Shield provided. Engineers constructed new roads through the desert. Supply units established fuel and ammunition dumps at intervals along the planned route. Communications specialists laid thousands of miles of cable to maintain secure command and control. Every detail had to be perfect because the plan's success depended entirely on surprise and speed. As 1990 drew to a close, President Bush made the fateful decision to double American force levels in the Gulf, ultimately committing over 500,000 American military personnel to the operation. This deployment exceeded American troop levels in Vietnam at the height of that conflict. The additional forces included heavy armored divisions that could only have one purpose: offensive operations to liberate Kuwait. The defensive phase of Desert Shield was ending. The question was no longer whether American forces would fight, but when and under what circumstances. The United Nations gave Saddam Hussein one final opportunity to avoid war. On November 29, 1990, the Security Council passed Resolution 678, authorizing member states to use all necessary means to enforce previous resolutions if Iraq did not withdraw from Kuwait by January 15, 1991. This was the clearest possible ultimatum: leave Kuwait peacefully or be forced out by military action. Diplomatic efforts intensified during the final weeks before the deadline. Secretary of State James Baker met with Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz in Geneva in early January, but the meeting produced no breakthrough. Saddam remained defiant, convinced that America lacked the will to sustain significant casualties, that the coalition would fracture under pressure, that he could survive any military campaign and emerge as the strongman who had stood up to Western imperialism. In the final days before the deadline, American soldiers wrote letters home, made peace with their mortality, and prepared for combat. Chaplains held services for soldiers of all faiths. Officers reviewed their battle plans one final time. Tank crews performed last maintenance checks on their vehicles. Pilots studied maps and target packages. The entire military machine was coiled and ready, waiting only for the order to strike. On January 12, 1991, Congress voted to authorize military action, with the Senate approving by a narrow margin of 52 to 47 and the House by 252, 183. The votes reflected the nation's ambivalence about war but gave President Bush the political support he sought. The deadline passed with no Iraqi movement toward withdrawal. The world held its breath, waiting for the war everyone knew was coming but hoping somehow might still be averted. Coalition commanders issued final orders to their units. In bunkers and command posts throughout Saudi Arabia, officers synchronized watches and confirmed communication protocols. The largest military operation since World War II was about to begin. And Operation Desert Shield was about to give way to Operation Desert Storm. But even as combat loomed, the months of Desert Shield had already achieved their primary objective. Saudi Arabia was secure. The initial panic of August had been replaced by a confident readiness. Iraqi forces remained in Kuwait, but had advanced no farther. The coalition had assembled overwhelming military power and unambiguous international authorization. The deterrent force that had rushed to the Gulf in those desperate early days had grown into a military juggernaut, capable of fighting and winning a major conventional war. Saddam Hussein had been given every opportunity to retreat with some measure of dignity intact. He had chosen instead to stand and fight, a decision that would prove catastrophic for Iraq and its people. The legacy of Operation Desert Shield extends far beyond the military victory that followed. The deployment proved that American armed forces could rapidly project massive power across the globe, a capability that would shape American foreign policy for decades. It demonstrated that international coalitions could still form and function even in a multipolar world. It validated the military technologies and doctrines developed during the Cold War, showing they were effective in actual combat rather than theoretical exercises. It established precedents about humanitarian intervention and collective security that would influence debates about military action in Bosnia, Kosovo, Rwanda, and countless other crises. For the soldiers who deployed during Desert Shield, the experience was transformative. Many had joined a peacetime military and suddenly found themselves preparing for mechanized warfare. Against a battle-hardened enemy equipped with chemical weapons, they adapted, trained, and ultimately succeeded beyond what many observers thought possible. The low casualties during the subsequent Desert Storm campaign vindicated the months of preparation, the rigorous training, the attention to logistics and planning that characterized Desert Shield. Lives were saved by the deliberate, methodical buildup rather than a hasty rush into combat. Yet Desert Shield also planted seeds of future conflict that would germinate in unexpected ways. The presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia, though temporary as promised, inflamed Islamic extremists who viewed any Western military presence near Islam's holiest cities as blasphemy. A young Saudi named Osama bin Laden, who had fought against the Soviets in Afghanistan, became radicalized by the American deployment and would eventually declare war on the United States. The decision not to remove Saddam Hussein from power during Desert Storm meant that Iraq would remain a source of regional instability, ultimately leading to another American invasion in 2003. The sanctions imposed during Desert Shield devastated Iraq's civilian population over the following decade. While leaving Saddam's regime intact, the world learned in 1990 and 1991 that international law could still have teeth, that aggression could still provoke consequences, that the community of nations could occasionally act in concert rather than in competition. These lessons seemed clear and unambiguous as American soldiers stood guard in the Saudi desert, waiting to see if their presence alone would be sufficient to convince Saddam Hussein to withdraw, or if words would give way to war. The shield had been raised, the line had been drawn, and the clock had run out on diplomacy. What followed would test everything that Desert Shield had built and determine whether the New World Order that President Bush envisioned could survive its first major trial by fire.